Hello, I'm Carl Stabe, and today I have Ryan Ford with me. He's an actuary, healthcare leader. I'm really impressed. We've already talked before this with your background, your enthusiasm for leadership. Before we hit record, you're like, it's a good day if I get to talk about leadership. Why do you enjoy leadership so much?
Nice. Well, thanks, Carl. It's great to be here. I've kind of, as I've grown my career, I've been in healthcare now 20 years, and I went from being sort of that individual contributor and sort of just owning kind of my core responsibilities to then seeing it amplify and see, sort of when you can be a good leader, how much scope and breadth you can have without actually doing it. And so I love sort of having that, I can set people in, up for success, or I can build the right kinds of teams or the right cultures or, the right goals and metrics to achieve those. And then seeing those, sort of blossom like a flower is such a fun experience. And sometimes I see breadth of my work that I didn't actually do anything that specific day. So that's some of my favorite parts of leadership, and just kind of seeing the success of my team or others around me, based on things that I've set up.
Yeah, I noticed you said, yeah, it's not like you're in the nitty gritty, getting your hands dirty, but you're seeing the fruits of your labor, that leadership skill, be able to play out in front of you. And I think this is a skill a lot of leaders struggle with. A lot of times people get promoted to the point where they have to take on that leadership role, but it's not something that comes naturally to them because, now you've got people complaining and now you got emotions and much different than, hey, here's a spreadsheet or here's, this this work, this project, go and do it. How do people make that shift in their head like you have?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course the book, the "What Got You Here Won't Get You There," right? And so there's kind of that mindset of, and I had this, call it 6, 8 years into my career where, first you're just trying to kind of get established and just sort of prove your worth, and why is this company paying me to do what I don't think is the level of value commensurate with what I'm making, but then shifting to, okay, now I'm really actually good at that piece, but then there's that element of broadening your scope, broadening your horizons. And frankly, there's people that are great individual contributors and they have, 40-year long careers where they don't manage people and they are really successful. And that's not me. I love sort of having that, or I realized this as I started, managing people and taking on different leadership roles. And, there's a difference obviously between managing and leadership. So you can be a leader without formally managing people. And I think having that ability to drive people and to inspire them, that's what makes it fun. I think that's what makes
Mm.
it, just sort of a skill that you can kind of pivot to, that's not just, hey, how can I do this job better or this task better, but almost reimagine how, kind of a team could operate, or, the scope of the work that your team is doing, or the effectiveness of that. And then, sort of ideally inspiring that culture and then seeing it through. That became really fun for me. That became way more fun than I would call it my day job. And so finding those opportunities, has really then kind of subsequently been a hallmark of my career.
And for me also too, coming back to your first answer is you've been able to put things in place that allow you to probably take joy in other people accomplishing work. Because I think sometimes we get caught up in our ego and we're like, well, I could have done it better, or oh, they made a mistake. And we can't let go of those feelings. And so therefore we micromanage, or therefore we take something back over. And to me, this comes back to the core of this podcast: systems. Having systems in place that allow you to thrive, but the people on your team to thrive. Is there like a real core, I don't know, a feedback loop system with your employees that you've put in place? And what does that system look like or process?
Yeah. I think one thing I've done is, as I've managed teams, there's kind of a difference between having just a, sort of just a set of direct reports and then having kind of an organization where you have, skip level people are kind of multiple layers underneath you. And so thinking about the latter, I think that's where the systems become more, more important, right? When you're managing five kind of people directly, the the systems I think become less um, useful as they do as you have 30 plus people in
Mm.
your organization. And so thinking about the broader organizations, I think I like to think, you know, about the top and bottom 10%. So that becomes, I think, a big part of my focus and being explicit about kind of who those are, working with my direct reports to identify broadly who's our top and bottom 10. And that becomes we tend to focus more on those people. And in the top 10, it's skip level discussions, it's identifying stretch projects, it's, challenging them with new work. You're kind of not, you're doing a disservice to them if you're not, pushing them as far as they're willing to go in some regards. And not, I don't mean working 80 hours a week. I mean stretching their kind of abilities and frankly building new skills for them. And so I think with those, um, I think having those kind of opportunities. Then with your bottom 10, it's setting the right expectations. It's not, letting them skate by. Doing that is kind of a disservice to the rest of your team. And so with them, it's really managing up, managing out. It's finding that right um, expectations and again not holding them to the gosh, well, we've only delivered this in the past. It's more of this is what we expect from you and or someone in this role and kind of can you deliver on that. And so I think that's that top and bottom 10 is a big one. I think another one that I've found to be really helpful is around delegation. So you mentioned kind of the micromanaging and that becomes a common misstep of new leaders, right? Is they kind of have this fear of letting go, especially if it's things that they've done and now they need to hand off to somebody. And I think that's one where I use this with all of my teammates is a decision tree. And so there's a picture, it's a simple just tree, and you have leaf, branch, trunk, and root. And so those four buckets, and you can imagine kind of what that means, different types of decisions falling into different buckets. And so that tends to be really helpful because when we talk about communication and effective communication, having really effective communication and efficient ones is something that you've set up in advance. So for example, I'll go through that with my team, and then in a one-on-one, they'll ask me for kind of a low-level decision or my input on that, and I'll say, that's a leaf decision. And let's move on. I'm not even going to answer your question. That means a leaf decision means you're making that decision and not even telling me about it. And so, kind of getting that cadence where we can have a similar language, I feel like that's a good system that, you don't have to then, belabor a point. You can keep moving quickly and get to, effective communication, but also efficient communication. I think that's a good system I've used. And then we'll get into metrics in a bit, so I won't kind of go there yet. But I think the other thing I would maybe point to is, leadership being 360 degrees, not just beneath you. And so, I think of leading as, leading up, leading with my peers, and leading down, and that having that, those are all portions of being a good leader. It's not just how you manage your team, it's working effectively with cross-functional partners. It is, when there's handoffs, being, clear on what handoffs can go. There's three teams that need to work together on something, kind of what's the right um, alignment of responsibilities and where are the right handoffs and how might that work kind of with the teams, especially when you as the leader aren't actually executing on that. And then there's managing up to kind of talk through, what's reasonable, what if we if we're being asked to do something that's new, different, challenging, stretch, uncomfortable, just sort of being, hopefully leaning into that, but also being, kind of eyes wide open as far as what's needed. And so whether that's clear resources, and this is where tangible feedback is helpful, not just we need more or we need more people. We need these four hopefully tangible things that can be executed on to deliver on this. And then having, kind of with managing up, sort of having those short-term objectives and then also long-term as well. So you're really oaring towards something while also kind of meeting those different checkpoints along the way.
Okay, so a couple things I'm hearing from uh, my brain. I'm drawing the system because I think it's really how we build habits, right? And what you're trying to do, back to the leaf decision, I think it's cool. You're just basically saying, this is how I'm viewing this, and this is how I want you to view it as well. So you're setting that standard and you're saying, okay, this is the type of decision that shouldn't require my help. Now, I think it's important to be able to communicate that back, right? And maybe even that's not even a communication. It's so minimal. It's like, you know, you I guess gave a donation, as a manager, you're allowed to give donations under $50, whatever per quarter. I don't know. But the idea is like, hey, it's $51. And you're like, okay, come on, this is a leaf decision. You don't really need to let me know. But the idea is to help them understand what those patterns are, what those systems are, and then make sure it's clearly defined so they feel comfortable, right? Because I think this is too what happens so often is somebody comes on the team, whether it be hired or moved from a different department or whatever, and now they're trying to figure out their manager or their leader, and the reality is they often don't get a playbook. They don't, this is a big thing I disagree with. Like, if you're going to become a leader, I love the idea of having like a leadership playbook, right? And having like, this is how I look at things. This is how I like to communicate. This is, and this is the type of feedback I'm looking for. And this is the type of feedback I'll give to you, right? You're setting these standards up front. And so they know right away what to expect. Now, yeah, things adjust and, things shift around, but from the whole, it's like 80% there. And so to me, this comes back to, that leadership style. And before today, we hopped on a quick call to talk through some stuff. And I want to hear the story about how you inherited this struggling team of 35 people. Kind of give us that breakdown, what happened, and then what systems really helped you get through that and then eventually thrive.
Yeah. So I've been in corporate America my whole career, which is a very different, leadership dynamic than, startup businesses or things like that. And so, I think many of those that have been in corporate America can kind of empathize with this situation. This is probably more extreme than what I dealt with in the past and others, but that all of a sudden, corporate going through a round of layoffs and usually I've seen those and, it becomes news events, but it hasn't really impacted me or my area. And this one, it ended up being, I had a boss and he had four direct reports. Well, the boss and three of those direct reports all got laid off. And then also the leader that my boss reported to also became kind of unrelated to the layoffs and was a new leader was named. So we have major changes happening, and all the while, with every layoff, it ends up being the we need to do more with less, right? And so it's that classic story. It ended up impacting me, and so my team more than doubled, and sort of became my boss without sort of a change in title, pay, et cetera, but a different an added setup. And it wasn't just, more than doubling the size of my team. It was, a team that had kind of been this once proud, team that was critical to the operation we were doing, and and had fallen on really hard times. And so this team, had once been really relied upon, and and in the last couple of years had really fallen down. Whether it was the quality of their work, the timeliness, the the communication to and from, their partners, kind of all of the above was really strained. And as we found out later, a lot of it was, in the past, it wasn't because this team had a strong foundation. It was, you had a lot of individuals, that were really compensating for the lack of, effective structure within the organization. And so, you had a lot of people that were working crazy hours a week, and they were kind of taking everything on, and they had had, this specific experience, but the documentation was poor, the technology was poor, the delegation was poor. And so then when those people left, which truly happens, then a lot fell down. And so it was, when you take those key pillars out, and you don't have a strong foundation, a lot falls down. And so that's what happened. And so, here I am kind of coming into this, just kind of trying to keep up with my old team. And now I'm being sort of tasked with sort of this major turnaround effort. And so it, and then in addition to that, you had this, leader of that team had left, and there was kind of battle lines that were drawn, amongst those that remained. You had either, you know, team, gosh, I'm glad this person is gone. Now we can get to what we needed to do, and now we can succeed. So you had that team, and then you had another team, another faction that was of the, this person is critical. This is one of those pillars that was holding us up. And how are we ever going to move forward without this person? Like, we are going to just suffocate from that. So you had kind of different, um, sides of that. And so, and then naturally, as you can expect with, a team that had fallen on hard times, you had a lot of finger pointing, right? You had, this new person came in and they couldn't keep up with what that old person was doing. This person tried to change the culture, and that's why we didn't succeed. And, other fingers being pointed at, these people have always done it this way, and then the business has changed and they can't adapt to it. And so you had a lot of that kind of classic finger pointing, blaming story. And so, and then here we are staring down kind of the busy season that's about to hit. So this team had sort of a cyclical, and it wasn't that work stopped in non-busy season, but it really, call it like a hurricane season where, stuff really hit and you really had to be prepared. And that was, kind of a month or so away, from where, when I kind of took this. And so it, so we're staring down this barrel, and I think as this team, the metrics that we were accountable for was meeting 95% of our deliverables. Well, here I am have a team that's saying, if we kind of keep on this same trajectory, we're probably going to miss over 50%. And so this is a critical,
50%?
over 50%. It was so, and this wasn't a, I'm just upset about this and in a rage and just trying to use numbers. This was a sober estimate, that they had said, these things, the work that we're being asked to do has grown, the people from which to do it has shrunk, the level of talent, the level of experience in that role has shrunk. We've lost some of these critical people, and and how we need to do it has changed as well, and kind of need this, without this technology solution that will enable us to adapt to this, we're really going to be underwater. And so, that's kind of the situation that I walked through. Meanwhile, I'm trying to kind of, compensate with this boss of mine that I had, followed with a few different roles, and I have a lot of respect for, has now just departed, and so there's kind of my own feelings of all of this. So that was quite a fun, just news to hear as I really unpack this. And so it, I think that was where it was, once I kind of got a lot of that, here's the situation, which is a grim one, how do we start picking up the pieces, right? And that's where I think systematically you can really, point to some lessons of, when you're in a crisis, kind of how do you respond? And so, my first priority was kind of really learning the team dynamics. So, who does what on the team? Who are the people? Kind of understanding those battle lines and why certain people feel the way they do, about that leader, and kind of the finger pointing and understanding that. Because without that level of understanding, you really can't move anything forward. And so that was kind of my first priority was really, understanding kind of the team dynamics and people. Secondly, it was kind of understanding the team situation from outside the team. So there was a lot of, their customers were the ones, complaining about falling down in the past, right? And so, truly understanding from those customers, and again in a non-heated way, and not, if you're provoking them, you're going to get a defensive reaction. So really trying to find the right forum to engage those people in a constructive and a tangible and fact-based and non-emotional driven type of a forum, and to really hear, here's the situation as our customers feel it. And some of that you get to then weigh of this is real, this is not, this is, gosh, this customer is having unrealistic expectations. These are internal customers, by the way. And so having but also trying to keep that quiet and just kind of sit back and listen. And so I think that was a key piece is just sitting back and listening, not trying to oversolve too quickly, but really just trying to understand the situation from, kind of that 360 mindset that I mentioned of from above, from the sides and below. And then and then it was, okay, now what do we do? So first it was the people thing was to me the most critical element, because without a well-functioning team, there was no chance we were going to, do anything with any success. And so we had a really effective offsite where we, some of the budgets didn't allow for this, but we made that work, and we got everybody together in a kind of a safe, neutral space. People started voicing their concerns. We set it up in a way that was, that we're not going to oversolve quickly, but we're going to just listen. And then it also, we got them to be really candid about, kind of what was happening. And then we kind of open things up into a little bit more of the human element. And so it's, as I've learned over the years, it's much harder to point fingers at, someone really well and you can empathize with their story, as opposed to just a person or a name that you've never met, right? It's a lot
That's
easier to
so important.
point those
Yes.
fingers. And so we did heavy team building. We went into, stories of childhood and personal struggles and family challenges, and, really kind of made it a safe enough space that people were willing to share. It wasn't a forced sharing, but people got there that they wanted to share some of those things. And that was, I feel like, probably the most critical step, because then it was, we could get people kind of, rallying around we are, kind of here's who we are as people, not really broke down the battle lines. I would say that meeting and that kind of those elements really then said, all right, let's everybody drop their arms. Let's now talk as one team, and let's start, kind of tackling this. And so then we went through, in a prioritized manner of here's what we need to accomplish. And, when people tell me one of my most nails on chalkboards, response from people is when I ask for priorities and they say everything's a priority. Because if you're saying everything's a priority, then you're actually saying nothing is a priority. Because if you say everything is, it's just you can't work with that. And so we identified a good, prioritized list of this is what we need to accomplish. And some of it was short term, some of it was long term, some of it was, things that we could execute on as individuals. Some we needed a broader team to do, some we needed broader organizational input. And so we tried to kind of put into buckets of here's how we're going to attack this. We've got this common problem that we know that we're going to miss these deadlines, and what do we need to solve that? And so, some of it was technology. And so there was this technology project that had for years been sort of 90% complete. And so that was, sort of a key linchpin of, without that, we never would have met kind of where we got. And but it was always that like, well, we don't have time to work on the last 10% of this project. So we do all these other things. But it was actually flipping that. We don't have time not to solve this because this is the, sort of that holy grail, if you will, where without it, we will not succeed. And so we got people to say, we need to take this to the finish line. And so we did. So that became kind of our top priority that, um, and sort of actually getting that to the finish line. And then it was,
So a couple
um,
things real quick. I'm here. I love this, but I like to stop and just kind of reflect on some of the systems because the first system is really getting to understand the people involved. What do they do? How do they interact? What is their personality like? And then when you had this offsite, you created a safe space. You showed them, you know, this is about all of us. This is about us understanding each other and working with each other versus, here, just get this project done. And then you're like, okay, what do we do to really make sure, we're prioritizing what truly matters? Because this is what I think so many leaders get caught up is the lack of understanding where to put time and energy. Because I think, and resources, right? And if you can just focus on, and it's the Pareto principle rule of 20% of your effort gives you 80% of your results. And as a leader, I think this is a really important thing to highlight is you don't need to get everything done. You need to get the important things done, the things that are really driving the project forward, really, moving the needle, the metrics that are being tracked. And sometimes you're tracking the wrong things. And that's another thing. You've got to be, because you said at the beginning, tracking metrics, but I want you to finish your story, but that's where I want to go next. And okay, so sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. And so because it is, if you're constantly sort of, death by a thousand paper cuts, right? Like you can be really busy, but then not actually accomplishing anything. Or I shouldn't say anything, but you're not accomplishing nearly what you could is if, kind of that Pareto principle mindset. And so I think having that ability to identify what's our top objectives. Then we went deeper into the org. And so, you talked about kind of earlier on about, leaders who had never been formal leaders, just, those had been highly experienced. And we had a bunch of those. And so, and they were craving leadership skills and training and just something to kind of help them be a better leader. So we did kind of a mini crash course of leadership training and just sort of that micromanaging element and delegating to the lowest level and then also challenging your top talent. And so some of these people would say I have this superstar, and but then you would ask them to say, well, defend that kind of a top rating for this superstar, and they didn't have a lot to really defend that person. And it was like, well, if this is a superstar, they should be able to accomplish or kind of load balance some of your work, right? Like some of the bigger things on that leader's plate, that superstar underneath them should be able to do that. And so we identified some of those things. And it didn't do just that. What it also did is it created extra resources, if you will, in terms of leaders on the team. And so what I mean by that, it's almost like a captain of a sports team that is an extension of the coach, where the players on the team didn't need to ask the coach every single question, but that's what was happening, right? And the coach would then just, that leader would just answer the question. And instead, it was like, here's the captain of this team. They're still not a coach, but they're a place that, that kind of player on the team can go to, for resources and kind of inspire that captain to be, sort of strengthen their knowledge. And it only had positive effects. And so we kind of identified that systematically where we said, let's again go to that 10% and make sure we've got that identified. And we actually went a little bit deeper in that of said, like, let's maybe let's see 20% of what that could look like, and the people that we would specifically focus on. And so we identified these are some of the stretch projects that those people can take on. So it kind of then helped load balance the direct reports, who of course were overworked and of course had, kind of no time for some of these other things. It was like, let's free that up by truly releasing these things. And releasing means release it, and then it's not going to go perfectly. It's not necessarily going to go the way you've done it, and you have to be okay with that. And so so I
How do
think
you
that was a
make that
key.
mental shift of being okay with it?
So I think some of it is about empowering. So me empowering that direct report of mine that, it's okay if this gets done differently, or I've got your back. And so, because a lot of people operate, micromanaging from a standpoint of fear, right? They're fearful of, this, if this doesn't go right, it's all on me. And therefore, if you want something done right, do it yourself, right? And so having that, kind of, I'll take that on, and then let's put, some metrics reporting or some other things in place that we know things aren't really going to go off the rails, that, small failures can happen. And sometimes I could prep leadership or other, kind of peers of mine to say, hey, we're trying this out, give us a little bit of grace. Think of the bumper sticker about a student driver. Think a little bit about that, right? Where you're a little bit different. You're not cutting off that student driver as much as if you didn't see that, right? So me prepping some of those people that said, hey, it's going to go a little bit differently, but here's why. And so there's just different ways of operating that and kind of removing that fear, which then I think really enabled the people to let go. And so and then also then having that mindset of it's not going to go right, and you can use teaching opportunities, and you can spend a little bit of time with that. That still is a lot less time of when you were just owning it. And so I think having that, and then also that's leadership training in practice, right? Where those are, some of those, it was a learned behavior, and it, kept evolving. But I think having those, that mindset, and sort of being specifically laying that out, and putting it on paper, not just kind of loosely talking about it, but putting it down on paper. This person's going to do this, and I'm going to step away from this. And so I think that was, sort of a key thing. And then it was sort of metrics, metrics, metrics. And so, we did a lot of, or that team did a lot of, we're really busy. We don't have kind of the time, but then you really asked kind of what are you busy with? And it was harder for them to really um, communicate that in an effective way that can enable people to help. And so when you're just, I'm busy, I'm busy, I'm busy, and then list, kind of 20 examples of things you're busy with, that becomes less tangible, something you can act on, as opposed to, let's put a list of, this was a team executing on, cases that we were quoting. And so, great, let's have a clear list of here's everything that we're working on, and here's where they stand in the process. Think of your Domino's pizza tracker of your, kind of where each quote is in the process. And then then you could kind of forecast of, based on it being here, we can estimate that it's going to be done by this date, so we can give that deliverable to somebody, and know that we might hit it. And frankly, that we could go to some people to say, look, we're going to miss, let's say, 20% of our timelines. Can we go to those people and say, is that okay? Like, is that, early on, you can maybe say a date was a date, and maybe it was firm and maybe it wasn't. And so some of those people said, yeah, that's no problem. We said, just said a month because that was an arbitrary number. And then we've internalized that month as being a, kind of hard and fast. But that person was like, if it's 2 months, it's 2 months. Versus others like, no, 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 it needs to be 3 weeks, not a month. And so really having that kind of, ability to kind of firm up our metrics. But first, we need the system to have in there. And then and then it allowed us to set a baseline to show improvement. And so, I kind of like telling the team of, if you get a B minus, it's like, is that a good grade or not? And naturally you're kind of high performer saying like, no, but what if you got a D minus last year and you got nothing different, right? Getting a B minus actually from a starting point of a D minus is actually, solid improvement. And so it, Conversely, it would be, if we want an A, here's what we need, right? And then I could go to leadership and sort of ask for tangible things of this is what we think we need to get an A. Right now, we're on a track for a B minus with some of the improvements we've done. And so I think that, that
I want to
baseline is very helpful.
pause there because I think it's really important to talk about setting expectations in leadership, right? Because in the end, what makes people happy is really that you've met the expectation of the person going into that engagement, right? And so you can often, to your point, change those expectations by asking, like, hey, do you really need this at this time? And so what you're saying is to create these metrics, you then have to go back and get some more data and then find out, okay, well, now we can shift this around. Let's put a little bit more energy or manpower or whatever into this project, while this one, we don't want to let it slip, but we're going to pause this for 2 weeks and then come back to it again once we get this in a good spot. And it just makes me think of what Charlie Munger likes to say, show me the incentives and I'll show you the results, right? And same thing with metrics. It's basically like we're tracking to this, and this is what's going to make people happy. And so what you're doing is you're adjusting those expectations as a leader and saying, okay, we are going to meet some of your expectations, but we're going to bring some of these other expectations down a couple notches. And then when you do deliver on that, people are like, oh, okay, like, well, that makes sense. I agreed to that, 4 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And that is that's a very important highlight in this podcast interview, because if you can help have those communication skills with the people that you work with, be it working with a client or be inside a company and you have partners, if you talk to them, explain what's going on, explain some of the roadblocks, whatever, you can help reset those expectations, which then makes it easier for them to say, oh, yeah, like they were great partners, or
Yeah.
yeah, they were great to work with. But that means really communicating clearly and well about, where things are headed and why they're heading in that direction, or might be lagging a little bit in that area.
Yeah. Yeah. I mentioned earlier that one of my nails on chalkboard things was, everything, if everything's a priority, nothing is. That another one is around because we've always done it that way, right? That's such a I hear that a lot, right? Why do we set a month as our deliverable time? Oh, well, because we've always done it that way. Or that, and so it sometimes challenging some of those status quo, we've always done it this way. Sometimes there's a good reason for it. So there's the because we've done it that way, and here's why it makes sense, right? Like I can buy into that. And but some of those, well, we've always done it this way, and we never really thought about, opening that box and you could think of it like the federal budget, right, where you have sort of your entitlement spending versus your discretionary spending. And if you only try to solve the 20% discretionary spending, you just can't do as much versus if you sort of challenge the entitlement, mindset. And so having that ability to kind of say, let's open this up and let's go and ask people and say like, okay, maybe this month timeline could be 2 months. And so and we ended up getting a lot of yeses. And so I think that when you got some successes, I think that's another thing I've learned is if you can get some quick wins, especially if you're coming into a new situation where you're a new leader on a team, your team can really respect you in that regard because they've seen you not just sort of talk the talk, but now you're actually delivering, a win. And that might just be a small win from you're just getting started, but having those tangible wins, then can get people to buy into, what he's saying actually makes some sense. And I can kind of get on board with this. And so I think
Yeah,
having
yeah.
those, ability to challenge and really set the right expectations, I think that was a critical step in it, as well as setting the right baseline for, you know, success from.
Yes, yes. Okay, I know we're coming up the time here. I love that story, and I think there's so many good systems in there. And I think this is an important point too, is reflecting, right? Look back on the decisions that you've made. And I find for myself, having a system around reviewing decisions helps you remember, helps you learn, helps you process, helps you let go of things because we all make mistakes as leaders. You know, it's like, well, if I'm being honest with myself, I did the best I could with the information I had. Okay, so I want to shift it a little bit. Is there a leader that you would like to thank? Somebody that really helped you in your career, somebody you learned from? And what is
Yeah.
that thing that you learned and and what was it and how did you apply it?
Yeah, so this was a leader that I didn't directly report to, but she was a president of kind of a market that I supported. And so, I think some of the features that she had that I would sort of, try to learn from or try to emulate would be, sort of one, having a neat, unique ability to present effectively upward while also downward. So I mentioned that 360 view. She had that ability to, kind of talk to the highest levels and then also have casual conversations, with the executive assistant types and really had that ability or kind of the analyst levels, kind of in they might be levels below her. And she was able to know, kind of about their family or their dog's name or, key dates of theirs. And so I think having that ability to do both is really inspiring. I think having that putting systems in place to then hold people accountable because it's impossible just to be the enforcer as a single leader. So having the right metrics, the incentives, the accountability, and she had a strong chief of staff that she put a lot of effort into. That person helped each of the leaders kind of execute on their whether they were setting goals or measuring the goals or getting it in the right format. There was a lot there that in terms of delivering on kind of what those metrics and that system required. I think she did a phenomenal job of sort of holding a high standard, having someone that can really help, kind of other leaders deliver on that. And then I think she could also handle really difficult personalities. So as a leader, you're not just dealing with people that are like you. There's whether it's cultural or gender or age or just kind of levels of experience that you're kind of constantly being put into conflict with kind of different people. And as a leader, being able to effectively work with each of those different people in different ways, I think is really a inspiring um, trait. And then lastly, I would say, kind of that highly inquisitive nature. And so that ability to ask really good questions, kind of that situations never seemed too big for her because she could kind of ask questions to really like get to the core of something. And once she understood that, could then kind of make judgments, but really listened and asked good questions. And so I think and being unafraid of doing that. There's a lot of people that are kind of afraid to ask certain kinds of questions of certain people. And I think she wasn't. And so, being confident enough in herself that, enabled her to ask those questions. I think that was another like really strong skill that, that I try to emulate.
I love that. Oh, this is great. Thank you. This has been fantastic. Where can people go to find out more about you?
So LinkedIn, Ryan Ford, we can put the link up to my LinkedIn. And
I'll put that in the
um,
show notes.
yeah, yeah.